Thanks to Manuel and Makian and the whole team here at University of Illinois and our co-sponsors at University of Florida. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to think through some of these questions together. I'm based at St. Louis University, where we also I'm a co-director of our Center for International Comparative Law, and we have a symposium once every 2 years, and it is happening now. So hello to my colleagues in the future who watch me playing hooky. I have snuck away for the morning, but I will be going back, unfortunately, to St. Louis this afternoon. Not unfortunately, because it's going to be great there, but I'm going to unfortunately miss the other presentations live. I'll be taking them in, and so many of you will be hearing from me by email. Thank you for the accommodation, and my apologies in advance for not being here in person to hear the rest of the talks. I was put on the law panel, fair enough. I'm a legal academic. I'm also an anthropologist. A discussion of law as a mechanism for Ukraine's relationship with Europe and as a mechanism in identity formation could legitimately focus on a timeline that looks like this. In 2014, the two sides, the EU and Ukraine, signed a legal framework, the association agreement. Visa-free travel commences February 28th, 2022. Ukraine presents its application for EU membership. I give the specific date and not the year because that's significant. The war started on February 24th. The full-scale invasion phase of the war started on February 24th. The Ukrainian diplomatic service, the foreign ministry, sprang into motion. They saw their moment, and they presented their application for EU membership. It was considered and endorsed last summer. So that's one way that one could approach talking about law and the Ukraine-Europe relationship and identity formation. A more situated discussion could give a political history for the context of that law, and that would necessarily in Ukraine implicate a discussion of citizens, citizen activism, citizen movements. And here I have a slide of December 1st of 2013. In 2013, the then president of Ukraine, President Yanukovych, continuing the policy towards European integration of his two predecessors, his government had negotiated an association agreement with the European Union. He was supposed to fly out on a Friday to Lithuania to go sign it. The previous weekend, he was invited to Moscow. He came back from Moscow on a Monday and announced that Ukraine would not be signing this agreement, and he announced a reversal of this policy. That ignited a very small handful of citizen protests. I've interviewed some of them, and by interviewing some of them, you've interviewed almost all of them. There's a small number of citizens that came out to protest immediately, and a handful, less than 100. And their prediction was that these protests would fizzle, people would get tired, and that would become the new status quo. But instead, the Ukrainian government used force to try to disperse the demonstrators. That ignited a citizen response. Those who were ambivalent about Europe or undecided about Europe were definitely not ambivalent about the use of force against protesters. And so where there had been a few thousand protesters on a Saturday afternoon after their attempt to violently disperse them on Saturday night, by Sunday morning, this is what we woke up to. Estimates of between 100,000 and 500,000 people in the streets. This protest movement became known as the Euromaidan. The Maidan is the central square in Kiev that the protesters were occupying, and it was a pro-Europe citizen movement. So one could situate a discussion of law in this movement. This slide here could be a book. As a matter of fact, it has been several books. Law was deeply implicated both in igniting these protests and in accelerating these protests. The Ukrainian government tried to suppress, for example, freedom of assembly by passing laws against occupying the square and other means. By February of 2014, the authorities, and I use that term, that ambiguous term deliberately, used live fire in an attempt to clear the square. Over the course of 2.5 days, over 100 protesters were killed by bullets, and the members of the president's own party then started to defect. They started to go out live on camera at the parliament, renounce their party affiliation. He lost a parliamentary majority. He signed a rapprochement agreement with the opposition, and then he that night fled the country. So I don't know what you call it in a democracy. If it were a monarchy, it would be an abdication. But when the president just leaves the country, we have this presence of the absence. So again, we could tell a story of law and European formation, situating it in a political history of Ukraine. What I would like to do today instead is to invite you on a kind of archaeological project. I'm going to introduce these 5 terms, and I'd like to think of them as conceptual tools. And with archaeology, if we excavate, then we find an object, let's say a hammer, and then we try to make inferences about what was the problem that these people were trying to solve. So I'm offering you some conceptual tools, and along with it, the subtext is I'm offering you an invitation to try to draw inferences about what problems these tools might solve. So the first tool that I'm trying to work with is deixis, and in the interest of time, if this is old hat, please just let me know, because I don't want to repeat things that are already familiar. But I'll continue until somebody waves me off. So, deixis, it is a linguistic category. In contrast to words with a stable referent, let's say like the paper, a deictic's referent depends on the context in which the deictic is uttered. So a few familiar categories to English speakers would be deictics of person, place, and time. Personal deictics encode the speaker's reference to oneself or others or third persons. So what do we mean by a word takes its meaning from the context of the word I? There's no stable referent for the word I. It depends completely on context to know what's the meaning of that referent. Place deictics likewise encode spatial location of the utterance, for example, here or there. And time deictics encode temporal points relative to when an utterance was spoken. For example, now, then, yesterday. So examples of deictics are demonstratives, like this and that, first and second pronouns, also grammatical tense is deictic, and specific time and place adverbs are deictics. So I'm now going to start reading. I'm going to switch my performance. I am going to, instead of starting our story in 2022, or instead of starting our story in 2014, I'm going to pick up the thread when I started summers of fieldwork in Ukraine, starting in the summer of 2002, and with 14 months of long-duration fieldwork in 2006 to 2007. At that time, when I undertook that fieldwork in 2006-2007, Europe, in Ukrainian Evropa, was a constant referent in contemporary Ukraine. A most common use was the expression Evroremont, which was contemporary slang for renovating, for example, one's apartment, up to a level of comfort and aesthetic appeal that would pass in Europe. So if you had an apartment, you were trying to undertake a Evroremont. Another compound word and a common form in which indexing shows up was Evrostandarti, a term of art for legal, regulatory, and ethical standards, either borrowed from Europe or transplanted from Europe, or perceived to be up to European standards. Factories have been retooled up to Evrostandarti. Foods are processed to meet Evrostandarti so that, like, for example, milk products can be exported. Evrostandarti of potential investors, companies try to comply with Evrostandarti so that potential investors before an IPO will be attracted to them. The lousy food stand across the street from my apartment, which you'll see in a subsequent slide, selling tough chicken, billed itself as the Evro Grill. So while the Western press stereotyped Eastern Ukraine as pro-Russian and Western Ukraine as pro-Western, Ukrainians, regardless of region, were keen to explain that all of them aspire to a European standard of living for Ukraine. Despite divergent views on geopolitical tactics or strategic alliances, Ukrainians found consensus on that. So while we could inquire into the meaning of that pervasive referent, what does it mean to be Evro something, what I became focused on was, what does its pervasiveness tell us? So, Seeing Europe from a Ukrainian point of view requires that we first consider the prior question of where those in Ukraine locate themselves, and that informs how Ukrainian legal elites see the West, how Europe and its forms are reshaping the legal landscape in Ukraine in turn. The fact that Ukraine is self-consciously a work in progress, is also significant for our understanding both of Ukraine and for what it can help us understand about ourselves. So here, in trying to understand the starting point for Ukrainians, where they locate themselves, the concept of deixis is really crucial. From linguistic anthropology, as I've said, deixis concerns the way languages encode and grammaticalize features of context. Peirce calls these indexable signs, Russell calls them egocentric particulars, Hanks has retooled that term to be sociocentric particulars. An investigation into here, now, and us, for example, reveals the succinctness with which language captures and conveys complex understandings. The here and now proximal zone has the appearance of concreteness, but as Bill Hanks demonstrates, that is a false appearance. Our ways of understanding and inhabiting even something as concrete as the here and the now draw on an immense stock of social knowledge that orients action and provides the categories with which we even delimit the here and now. Deixis then is intimately associated with the theme of the conference, with discourses of inclusion and exclusion, with the definition of we and they, whether you are one of us. Deixis includes social distance of Ukrainian and Russian, which is spoken by more than 80%, some say as many as 98% of Ukrainians. So for bilingual Slavics who are resident of Ukraine, as in some other Indo-Europeans, there's a difference in the second person familiar versus the second person formal or plural. So there's a ty and the vli. That those deictics encode social distance. Two words in Ukrainian translate into the English word then. It's very weird that the English word then could mean the past, or it could mean the future, right? And in Ukrainian, they make that distinction. It could be todi or potim. The fact that I'm waving my arms here and there and you know which way is the past and which way is the future is a perfect linguistic anthropology elision of space and time that we do in Indo-European languages. We spatialize time. Okay, so decoding deictics in contemporary Ukraine is complicated. Oh, I'm skipping my slides. So this is about how the context has become difficult for Ukrainians. This is obviously a map of when Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, and then that's the borders of Ukraine up until 2014, and perhaps the once and future borders of Ukraine, the aspirational borders of the government right now. So decoding deictics in contemporary Ukraine is complicated by this historical peculiarity. The context in which deictics depend for meaning has been profoundly disrupted. For Ukrainians considering collective identity, part of the problem with locating the referent for here, or there, or us, and them, lies in the very fact that the frame of reference became unmoored with the passing of the Soviet Union. And I will say that that frame of reference has now taken, that context has taken a direct hit as a result of the war, of the full-scale invasion particularly. To understand the kinds of forces exerted on that context, anthropological work on forms of change offers the useful concept of liminality. So this is my second concept. I promised you 5 tools. This is number 2. The liminal space is where Ukrainians recognize themselves. And this term liminality was introduced by a French folklorist, Arnold van Gennep, in his 1909 analysis of Rite de Passage. In this analysis, he meant such ritual processes as initiations, investitures, weddings, funerals, all social rites which accompany change of place, state, and social position. In a rite of passage, Van Gennep identified 3 phases: separation, the limen, and then reattachment to a stable or recurrent culturally recognized condition. So if you think, for example, of going from being a single person to a married person in the United States, the liminal phase would typically be engagement. You could even then narrow the focus down to a wedding celebration. You walk in a single person, then there's this liminal phase where you have these magic utterances, and then you walk out like magically you're married people. So it's like abracadabra, that is also a performative utterance that initiates a liminal phase, and then the frog becomes a prince. Okay, so the first and last phases detach ritual subjects from their old places in society and return them inwardly transformed and outwardly changed. And the middle, the liminal phase, is categorically trickier. Limen, I'm probably mispronouncing that in Latin, literally means a threshold in Latin. Although in some protected rites it's visualized as a corridor or a tunnel. Victor Turner, who is a subsequent folklorist elaborating on Van Gennep's theme, identified odd properties associated with this place of mid-transition, of liminality. The first odd property that Victor Turner identified was being betwixt and between. The liminal state, by definition, is located between established states of political jural structure. Those occupying a space of liminality evade ordinary cognitive classification. They suffer a paradox characteristic of liminality, of being both this and that, both post-Soviet and European, for example. It is in the paradox of being two things at once that as a result the liminal subject is culturally and socially sometimes recognized as neither post-Soviet nor European, for example. A second odd property of liminality is that of existing in a state of potentiality. If we start, we can start by comparing the liminal state with normal affairs in the world of productive forces. Imagine productive forces like banks or parliaments or universities. Action to maintain the systems and personnel of control of this world takes place in that culture's indicative mood, and I'm redeploying another grammatical term. In this linguistic analogy, Victor Turner suggests in the indicative mood, normal sociocultural processes have to do with what is happening in fact, not just with what is seeming to happen, with what is actual, not with what is pretended or imagined or fictitious or ostensible. By contrast, life may also be experienced in subjunctive or optative moods. Victor Turner cites the definition of subjunctive as designating that mood of a verb used to express supposition, hypothesis, possibility, rather than to state an actual fact. It is the what if. Similarly, the optative mood expresses wish or desire. So we're contrasting the indicative mood with living in the subjunctive, the as if, or the optative mood, if only. So that's where I would locate, and the reason I have these photographs of these houses in Chernihiv region I took in 2007. In Ukrainian vernacular architecture, there are charmed changes of color and decor around the spaces, around the liminal spaces where the inside meets the outside. Likewise, in Ukrainian folkloric blouses, the spaces where the inside meets the outside are where the flowers are embroidered, and they often are here because there's one piece of cloth here and then it gets sewed to an arm, so there was an opening there before the forms, and then there's usually something on the cuffs. And for friends that have embroidered those blouses, each stitch is a wish. It's a protective garment. And so likewise, these decorative motifs protect at that liminal space. This is a way of visualizing liminality. And we've just talked about liminality and the indicative mood and subjunctive mood. My third conceptual tool that I would offer you is penumbra. That comes from American legal thought. In order to avoid confusion, I'm trying to introduce this metaphor from American law, the penumbra. In U.S. constitutional jurisprudence, certain freedoms or privileges are held to exist by virtue of a certain relationship to a constitutional right or guarantee. Put another way, certain constitutional guarantees depend on the realization of other freedoms to give those guarantees life and substance. And that concept of the penumbra was at the basis of the Supreme Court's decision in Griswold versus Connecticut, which is the case that recognized a right to privacy in U.S. jurisprudence that does not appear in the U.S. Constitution, but is the foundation for subsequent rights of married couples to contraception, It was the foundation for Roe versus Wade, which has just been overturned. So this idea of the penumbra is a zone of permitted or enabled practices that exist by virtue of a relationship to rights, guarantees, or laws enumerated in written documents. So we have this right. Within the penumbra of that right occurs these other legal practices or legal doctrines. And the word penumbra, this wasn't something I knew before I went to law school. A penumbra, do you guys know this word? It's a shadow, in an eclipse, the shadow is the penumbra. So, in any case, the question is, does Ukraine stand in the penumbra of Europe? An empirical investigation into whether this designation is apt might re-examine what it means to be within a jurisdiction of Europe. 2006, 15 years before Ukraine was anywhere close to an association agreement with Europe. This photograph is a field of rapeseed planted. And this gives you an idea of what the penumbra looks like. Biofuels policy provides this insight. Consider this transformed landscape of north-central Ukraine. In only one season, it had shifted from its traditional dull brownish palette of wheat to the almost fluorescent yellow of rapeseed. Neon yellow now stretches to the horizon in many parts of Ukraine. A manager in the Kiev office of Monsanto explained that Ukrainians began to cultivate rapeseed primarily for EU biofuel use. Rapeseed cultivation escalated from 0 in 2004 to 600,000 hectares by 2006. What set off this change was new EU mandates that required member countries to contribute a certain amount of raw material for biofuel. But they didn't have to produce it themselves, so Lithuania was buying rapeseed from Ukraine to meet its quotas for biofuel. So the transformation of the Ukrainian landscape has happened before, within the penumbra of Europe, with or without formal accession. I have a section on hegemony, patronage, and power, which I will tantalizingly not explain, and I will move on. But you can imagine how hegemony might come into conversations about Ukraine, and I would just offer that it's more complicated and than some of my friends, specifically married to the concept of hegemony, feel. And then finally, last tool I want to leave you with is aspect, another grammatical category that expresses how an action, event, or state denoted by a verb extends over time. So familiar examples are imperfective and perfective verb forms. In English, I was going versus I went. In Ukrainian, bigati versus pobigati. A less familiar example to those of us who speak European languages is the inceptive aspect. The inceptive aspect, English approximates this with formulations such as to get plus an adjective, to get dark or to get warm. It focuses, the inceptive aspect connotes the beginning of something, inception. In Latin, this was formed with an infix of sc that would transform a word like amo into I love into I am falling in love, or to flower into starting to flower. Slavic languages regularly derive the inceptive aspect from unidirectional and imperfective verbs of motion. I won't unpack all of that. Suffice it to say that I'm bringing up this inceptive aspect part, and I will play this for you after our panel is over. I have a music video, and the game is to see how many times, and this is from the still from the video, how many times action starts and doesn't finish. And it is amazing. In this video, it's super trippy. Like the action keeps starting, and then there's never a denouement. Like a tension is set up, and then it never finishes. And my suggestion is that that's the state that Ukrainians have lived in this endless state of liminality since 1991. So if Europe is not a place, then what is it? That's the Evrogrill across the street from my apartment. It went from being a place that was over there, across the Iron Curtain in Soviet times, to being a future. It was a way of designating a future goal that was at the end of this liminal time. How has the question changed since the onset of the full-scale invasion? The question has changed from when is Europe for Ukraine to this question could be whither. And this is a picture of a small number of the 8 million Ukrainians who are now in Ukraine. When the war first started, the question was, where are you going? Where are you fleeing to? Where are you taking cover? And that, for me, raises the question, both because of the influx of refugees, but also because of the legal frameworks between Europe and the EU, and this would get us back to the hegemony part that I skipped. Who's going to transform whom? When we ask whether Ukraine, I would suggest we're actually also well advised to ask whether Europe. And my prediction about that is that Europe is headed for the Inceptive aspect. This continued, repeated sense of we're starting something, and then it goes poof. We're starting something, and then it goes poof. We're starting something, then it goes poof. That repetitious experience of the Inceptive aspect is how I would characterize Ukraine's experience of the liminal stage, whether it started in 1991 with the dissolution of the Soviet Union or the current liminal phase of war. And with that,